Okay, so last time we finished up looking at the ecosystems which are terrestrial, and today we are going to look at saltwater and freshwater ecosystems briefly. We'll also look at how species evolve through time, and we will look at productivity as a measure of what happens in these ecosystems. So one thing I wanted to make note of, and we will look at this later when we look at climate change, southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere. Most of the land masses are in the northern hemisphere. So that's not really interesting or important now, but 3 or 4 different times in the rest of the class we're going to recall this slide. Where are most of the land masses? Because that has profound implications with regards to global climate. So first, coastal wetlands. Coastal wetlands are areas where saltwater mixes with freshwater, maybe a river mouth. River mouth or something similar. So it's an area that's covered by saltwater. These are quite interesting ecosystems, and it's impossible to categorize them as one and the same. The ecosystem globally of all of the things that are here with the lowest species diversity is a salt marsh. The only genus that's there for grasses is Spartina. There are other coastal wetland systems, mangroves, other types of systems, where the biodiversity, the number of species that are there, is preposterously high, rivaling coral reefs for the highest biodiversity of aquatic ecosystems. So we're looking at biodiversity, the number of species, and then also productivity, which I'll define later, but it's a measure, again, of how much carbon dioxide these ecosystems take out of the atmosphere, or you could also say how much tissue the plants create as the base of a food chain. Same thing. I always love, my former chair would say to students, a salt marsh is 5 times as productive as a hayfield. And I always laugh. It's like, Rosen, they have no idea how productive a hayfield is. But it's super, super productive. It takes huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, makes grass at a very, very, very rapid rate. There are other ecosystems that are saltwater wetlands, coastal wetlands, that have virtually no productivity. So the point is here, you can't constrain these very well, except to say they're a place where the land and the ocean meet. Sometimes a river is there, so the salt water signal gets diluted, which makes it hard for organisms to live there. Sometimes you have very serious tidal fluctuations, so the organisms that live there have to have these amazing adaptations such that they can be on land for half of their, in mud for half of their lives, and underwater for half of their lives. So there are all sorts of adaptations. And again, when we talk about these in more detail, we will maybe say some more specifics. But for now, it's just a coastal area. The terrible thing is that the world has lost over half of them. Some countries have lost up to 90% of their coastal wetlands. 2 main reasons: tourism, getting rid of them so that there can be beaches, so hotels right on beaches, and also aquaculture and shrimp farming. So we've lost a lot of them. The ones that remain are wildly degraded. Why? Well, we can have agricultural practices in coastal regions that spews all sorts of organophosphates, pesticides, fertilizers, and sediment into these areas and really degrade them. It hurts us when we do that, because coastal wetlands are valuable storm buffers. They protect us from storms. They protect us from tsunami as well. They are also nurseries for larval fish. Fish have a larval stage. That's why it's really difficult to do the big fish in aquaculture. So they have to go into these areas where it's warm, where it's shallow, where there's a lot of organisms, where they can hide. So these are some of the zooplankton, some of the larval fish that are in there, and they get to hide from their predators until they're large enough to survive on their own. So when we destroy their nurseries, Then we complain that our that our fisheries are all in a state of decline. They're all fished at or above maximum sustainable yield. Well, what do you expect? You've destroyed the place where fish grow up. Not proselytizing, I'm just saying that in the sort of hierarchy or the continuum of ecosystems we should protect for our own selfish interests, right? These are important things to protect. These are important things to bring back wherever we can. So those are coastal estuaries and wetlands. Also, we have in coastal areas, but now, only in tropical areas, we have coral reefs. And coral is a mutualistic relationship between a polyp, or an animal, and an alga. The alga is called a zooxanthellae, and it needs light. It's an algae, right? So it needs light. And these can only survive in clear, warm, shallow waters. So what happened is you have the polyp, the animal that's seeded, and the animal builds a calcareous skeleton, and there's a lot of them, so then you have these amazing configurations. So they suck calcium out of the seawater, make skeletons, and the animal's sitting there, and then you have the alga that sits inside this cup of a polyp. This is a true mutualistic relationship, which means that both members need each other, they benefit from each other. So the animal excretes waste, like all animals do, carbon dioxide and nutrients. The alga, as a photosynthesizer, needs carbon dioxide and nutrients, and it excretes the waste product of oxygen, which the polyp needs. So it's this fabulous relationship, except, again, they can only exist in shallow, clear, warm waters that are pretty nutrient poor. Because they're really, really slow growing, it takes a long time for coral to grow. If you start overloading coral reefs with nutrients from coastal animal farming, pigs, cows, sheep, chickens, then macroalgae, seaweed, grows on top of the coral reefs. Wow, lots of nutrients and light, and the algae die. If you start practicing overgrazing or poor agricultural practices, all of which we'll talk about in a couple of, maybe a month, sediment will run off onto the coral reefs and light is blocked. So the polyp gets stressed, ejects the zooxanthellae, which is the alga, and it dies. So we have coral bleaching, we have corals dying everywhere. We also add to this because I don't care what saltwater aquarium enthusiasts say, it is a terrible, terrible, unsustainable hobby to have. These things come from tropical countries. People use cyanide, they use electroshocking to stun the fish, not kill them, stun them, and then catch them in these baskets, and there you go into an aquarium or to a fish store. But the coral don't live through the cyanide and the electroshocking. In some cases, they actually put dynamite in these reefs and blast through them. Again, whether it's to start aquaculture or also to have pieces of coral that go into aquariums. So saltwater aquarium is a really bad idea from the standpoint of preserving the biodiversity of these systems, which are the highest biodiversity of all of the saltwater systems, of all the aquatic systems. The interesting thing is they have very low productivity. They're slow growing, so there's not a lot of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere or out of the seawater, same difference. So you have low productivity, high biodiversity, which is the opposite of a salt marsh, which has extremely high productivity and about as low biodiversity as you can get. So these two metrics are valuable indicators of coral reefs. I'm going to go up one because I didn't say much about this. Estuaries, coral reefs, because of the tides, this is also an important source of nutrients for offshore. So the tide comes in, and these decomposers are decomposing things, and then the tide goes out and pushes this pulse of organics and nutrients offshore, which offshore ecosystems can use. And you know all the arrows. This is in your book, so not much to say about this. Mostly grasses, lots and lots of decomposers. Coral reefs, again, biodiversity is tremendous, tremendous, tremendous. But productivity is low. They're slow growing. They're easily disturbed. So this is not a happy situation for a high biodiversity ecosystem. Also, ozone thinning, we'll talk about way later in the class. These are super sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, and we're destroying the ozone layer. So for that reason, and the reason mostly of farming, again, I would say if you're interested in seeing these, go see them now, because my educated guess is they're not going to be here for the rest of your life. All coral reefs globally will be gone. What does that mean? That's up to you to decide. So moving briefly into a freshwater environment, we have lakes, rivers, and wetlands, and we'll spend a lot of time when we talk about water resources looking at lakes, rivers, and wetlands. A lake, salient parts of lakes, let me just show you this picture and I'll come back up to that. The salient parts of lakes is that we have this turnover that happens. We talked about it when we talked about the top 10 coolest things about water. A lake is configured like this. You have these slides. This is in your book, so you don't have to try to draw it. But during the course of the spring and summer, the bottom is very cold and there's not much going on here. Maybe if you are lake swimmers, lake dwellers, you know swimming and you dive in, you have this really sharp gradation where the water gets freezing, right? And then there's warm on the top. There's a stratification of temperature. So this is the recipient of all the dead things moving down to the bottom and not being broken up because there's not a lot of oxygen and it's cold. At the top, we have lots and lots of algae. In many cases, again, those of you who are lake dwellers know, too much algae, right? We'll talk about lake pollution later. You have lots of vegetation at the shore, and then you have phytoplankton up here. The fish are right under the surface. And so you have this nice situation where it's warm, lots of nutrients, lots of light. Through the summer, the nutrients are all used up in a non-polluted lake. And then you have ice freezing on the surface, right, because it's less dense than water. And so this becomes warmer than that. And so the fish and the organisms come down here over winter because everything's relative. And then when the ice melts, this water is now colder than the relatively warm stuff from beneath. And you have this turnover, and it's in this way that lakes are able to maintain a healthy ecosystem and way of living. Now you have all the nutrient-rich water coming up to the surface, phytoplankton, algae start blooming again, and you have a good situation. Lakes are very easy to pollute because there's not water coming through them very rapidly. Yes, you have in-current streams. Yes, you have ex-current streams. But the water sits there for a long time. It's really still. And so it's easy to really, really pollute them, especially those of you who live in Massachusetts. The lakes around here were often used as repositories for industrial waste. And so a lot of the lakes around here, really shallow, kind of mud puddles with all sorts of toxic sediment. Not good news. Oh, sorry. And then rivers. Again, we're going to talk about these really as a source of water for humans. Rivers, you know, there's some slope, the water's flowing really quickly. This is actually a good place to put waste, especially human sewage. Again, you don't want to overload it, but as we'll see, it's cold, there's a lot of oxygen, it's flowing really quickly, and the bacteria and microbes in lakes are able to quickly and effectively break down human sewage. And so it is a way that we treat sewage. We used to dump raw sewage in, now we dump primary and secondarily treated sewage that still has a lot of nutrients in it. So, and we also use it as a valuable water source. So you have to, sort of textbook way of doing things is to take your water from here and dump your sewage down here. Because of the flow, you won't have this contamination. But it's a problem when more and more people want to use the river water. You have one town taking water from here, discharging their waste here, and then the next town is taking water from here. So that's a situation that we'll discuss. And wetlands, just like the coastal wetlands, these are inland areas, wet most of the time. The definition is quite technical, I won't get into it now. Much wet most of the time. same thing. They can be really high or really low biodiversity, really high or really low productivity, but they're valuable sources of water for us. You might have been in a swamp before and think it smells bad and it's gross, but under the surface, the water is quite clean and quite pure, and there's a lot of it. And so we use wetlands for water supply. And the value there is that wetlands are able to absorb and expand and contract because they're such a porous and biologically based medium. So in times of high water, they can prevent flooding because they store water. And then in times of low water, we can always go to them as a source of water because they hold it and only slowly expel that water. So we really like to get water supply from wetlands because of that. They're also, again, buffers for storms. So we saw the lake. And now, briefly, again, the real nuts and bolts of evolution and how life formed is the subject of another class. But what we know, based on the geologic rock record, is that Earth is 4.6 billion years old. For about 1 billion years, it had no oxygen in the atmosphere. For about 500 million years, there was no atmosphere whatsoever. So the early atmosphere outgassed through volcanoes. And you had an atmosphere of nitrogen and carbon dioxide and methane and all sorts of other things. And then life spontaneously formed, again, as evidenced by the geologic rock record, which is religion and science can be two different things. So these organisms, photosynthetic bacteria, started taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping their waste product of oxygen into the atmosphere. So about 1 billion years ago, and we'll get more into detail about this when we talk about climate change, the atmosphere became stable. And then when it became stable, with oxygen in the lower atmosphere, and oxygen actually migrates into the upper atmosphere, is hit with light energy, becomes ozone. We'll look at that also later. Life could survive on land. So it's kind of a neat situation where we have life habiting all of these different zones. I thought I had the Miller experiment in here, right? Yeah, okay. So I kind of glossed over, how did life evolve from nothing? There are several scientific theories. Some hold that life rode here from a meteorite, specifically from Mars. There is evidence, again, this is the subject of Cosmos, different class entirely, that there was liquid water on Mars back through time. Remember, you need liquid water to form life. So life started out on Mars as simple bacteria and rode here on a meteorite and came through our atmosphere, ionizing, hit Earth, making stishovite the highest temperature and pressure quartz there is, and then hopped off and colonized Earth. I tell you, I don't like to tell you my beliefs and my thoughts on things, but maybe you can see my tongue in my cheek about this. I don't know how likely that is, but there are those that hold that. And indeed, we found a Mars meteorite, I think back in the early 90s, that some to this day think has evidence of life on it in the form of a protein coat of a bacterium. Some say no, some say yes. It's who knows. Another theory is that the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, before there was a good atmosphere up here, were spewing out warm water with lots of different elements dissolved in it, and those elements eventually grouped up to form early life. And then that life existed in hydrothermal vents for a long time before it was carried by ocean currents up to shallower regions. The organisms that are in hydrothermal vents are incredibly ancient, so that could be. Again, I don't like to tell you what I think, but this is brilliant. This is the thing that if I was a betting person, I would bet on. This is another form of chemical evolution, but it involves the shallow seas. And it's really amazing what these people did. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, you don't have to know those names, but that's in my brain, so why not spew it out like, wanted to see if you could evolve life from the non-living. And so they set up this simple glass apparatus designed to mimic Earth's early environment. It's brilliant. So here you have an enclosed, the whole thing is enclosed, but you have an enclosed glass flask that's filled with pure water. It's nothing but water. And there's a heat source here. So that water, as you know from the properties of water, is absorbing the heat and evaporates. And it comes up into this chamber over here where Stanley Miller and Harold Urey put the gases that we know from the geologic rock record were in our atmosphere before life was here. Methane, ammonia, water vapor, hydrogen, nitrogen, all those gases, simple gases, you put them in there, they put them in there, and then sparked every so often. The spark is to mimic lightning. Our atmosphere was quite turbulent back in early history. Again, volcanoes are going off all the time, there's all sorts of ash, and there's lightning. And lightning in this environment now has the power to combine elements. You have water vapor, you have these elements, you have lightning, and now here's a little jacket that has cool water in it. It's not in contact with the gases, but it just cools down the stuff that's in there, the water vapor and Earth's early gases. And so you're circulating water through here, you cause heat to be removed, and so the water rains. And the water is trapped here in a trap, which is intended to be the ocean. And so they let this run for, I think, 2.5 weeks. During the course of 2.5 weeks, the water in this trap went from clear to light yellow to pink to brown. And at the end of 2.5 weeks, they pulled out water and analyzed it in a mass spec, and they found amino acids, which, as you all know, are the building blocks of life. So they hand-waved, so Harold Urey was the grad student, wrote a very short doctoral dissertation and was courted by every major university out there. Oh my gosh, he's brilliant. The hand-waving we've since revisited, and the way that I like to describe the hand-waving, I read it in a book, for them to do this and then say, hence life evolved, is equivalent to you going to the library and blowing it up to smithereens, all the books just in smithereens. Taking, when the dust clears, taking one little tiny piece of one page of one book in the library and using that to reconstruct the whole library, not just the book, the whole library. So I think that's an effective way of saying that hand waving was quite a lot. It wasn't just, oh, so then you just put these three together and you have it. And since then, many people have tried to duplicate this and have tried to go even farther and try to have more complicated amino acids, and they have reproduced their results, but they have not formed sea monkeys in the water in the trap. So their rebuttal is, yes, but you guys are doing this for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, as did we, or even a month or 2 months or a year. This was going on for 1 billion years, and you only needed to have this happen once. And so what they say is that the amino acids started to group up into layers of hydrophobic and hydrophilic, water-loving and water-hating chains. Started to just group together, and the waves are going back and forth. So now I have these molecules where the hydrophobic layers are sticking up, the hydrophilic layers are underneath, and then wave action, eventually when a chain got long enough, it grouped it into a circle. And when you have a sphere like that, then you can start regulating the internal environment. And in that way, prokaryotic bacteria, which is essentially little balls of water anyway, formed. And then things got, again, over the course of 3.6 billion more years, got more and more complicated. So those who haven't studied evolution kind of think that it's a ridiculous marching toward an end game, and we are the top of the evolutionary pyramid, or whatever you want to say, tree. That's not the case. Through time, again, you can look at this in the geology of Earth. digging down through time in rocks exposes the fact that animals have a shelf life of about 1 million years, and then they die. The whole species dies out. Whether it's a meteorite impact, whether it's climate change, whether it is their lake dried up, they die out. And old ancient species, shark, 3.5 million years, but that's about as old as we get. So they die out. So new animals are always forming, and plants and bacteria are always forming and dying out, forming and dying out, randomly in the face of the changes in their environment. This is not guided. Natural selection you hear about. This isn't the strongest survive, meaning that the biggest moose gets to live and the weakest moose gets killed by the jaguar, whatever lives in moose territory. Caveat survey course, right? I'm not a moose biologist. But here's an example of evolution. Oh, sorry. There are two types. There's microevolution. We in this room are exhibiting microevolution right now. We are all Homo sapiens. We can all interbreed and produce viable offspring. That said, if you look around you, we have a lot of differences in our eye color, in our hair color, in our skin color, in our height, in our weight. All of these genetic differences mean that though we are all one species, we have genetic diversity, right? Again, I'm not going to teach intro bio here, but we have genetic diversity. What microevolution says is that humans are a really bad example because we keep all of ourselves alive, more or less, right? So thinking about rabbits, right? Rabbits have different genetic components. It may be that some rabbits are able to tolerate lower temperatures. So randomly we have a really, really, really cold winter, and all the rabbits in that population who don't have the gene that enables them to survive super cold temperatures die out. And they could be big, strong, robust, fertile rabbits, but they died out because they didn't have this weird gene that enabled them to survive a cold winter. The opposite could also happen. We could have a really, really, really hot summer, and some rabbits have a gene that enables them to tolerate high temperatures. And as it turns out, the rabbits that have the gene that allows them to tolerate low temperatures lack the high temperature gene, so they all die out. So you see, this is just at the whim of the environment. There's no guiding plan here. Couple of things. So you can, it's funny, people who don't study this, who don't take the time to understand it on an even basic level, say, oh, there's no such thing as evolution. You can show evolution in maybe a year by looking at fruit flies. Fruit flies have genetic diversity. Spray them with pesticide intended to kill them, you kill 99% of them. 1% has a gene that lets them live through that chemical. Guess what? They all start breeding like crazy within, because the fruit fly lifespan is quite short, within a month, that chemical doesn't work on them anymore. You have to get a different chemical. Kill 90% of those, 10% live. So you can show evolution quite quickly. Let's see, industrial evolution, we'll talk about climate change. There's a moth called the salt and pepper moth over in England. Salt and pepper moth, exactly what it looks like, white and dark together. It sits on the tree bark, and it sits on ash trees, which are quite light. So the moths that are mostly white and some black were preferentially sorted by birds. Were preferentially protected by the light ash tree. Some of them had a genetic signature so that they were more dark than light, and birds preferentially ate them because the birds could see the darker moth. Then we came along with our Industrial Revolution, burning coal without any filtration. Everything got covered with coal ash. Everything is very dark now, this brownish, blackish stuff. Now, the ones that were threatened with extinction all the time because they were preferentially sorted for by the birds were protected completely because we put coal in the air. And now the light ones that were doing really well are all eaten by the birds. So, I could go on all day talking about how we have documented evolution. It's not open to debate. There is genetic diversity. There are mutations that allow some organisms to survive better than others in an environment, but then it's just whim. What happens? Is there an ice age? Is there an interglacial period? Are humans going to start burning fossil fuels? Eventually, we end up with different species. So yeah, not a good example to use humans. But what about this fox? We have this fox and was one species. Now, Pangea breakup, plate tectonics played a role here. The fox was living on land. Slowly, through millions of years, the continents are breaking up. Some continents are moving northward, some are moving to more tropical areas, and the fox population is quite successful, so it's spreading out of its own volition. But eventually, if you let enough time go by, you have a fox that is the Arctic fox that has these adaptations. I won't read them all off. Short ears to minimize heat loss, lots of white fur, because that enabled that fox to preferentially survive in the environment in which it found itself. The ones that were on the southern tip and then were being brought south by plate tectonics adapted to heat. Long ears, long feet, so they could exchange heat with their surroundings. Different color fur, long nose, which also gives off heat, allows it to survive in very hot temperatures. Now you have two different foxes. They are completely different species. They may not interbreed. They may not produce offspring. But it's easy to track them in the geologic rock record back to one common ancestor. And it could be that this fox on this continent, the continent moves too north, and so you end up with it just going extinct. It could be that sea level causes the fox on this continent to submerge and become extinct. So that's the point with evolution. It is happening. It's happened for all of the history of Earth where we have life, and extinction happens all the time. Over 98%, almost 99% of species that have been here on Earth are now extinct. Again, the average lifespan of an organism is about 1 million years. We've had life here for 3.6 billion years. So that is a situation with evolution, extinction, how life changes within these ecosystems as you march through time. So the last parts of 1042, okay, last parts of this are, I'm going to skip, no, you know what, I'll just say them briefly. Not much to say about this. You'll see it in the slide. Earth is a system, an integrated system. Systems have two things. They have structure. In this case, we've looked at the structure of ecosystems throughout the course of this lecture. We have the primary producers taking the sun's energy, primary consumers, secondary, then you have decomposers, the abiotic chemicals go back in to the producers, and you have this cycle, right? So that's the structure of an ecosystem, the setup. You can describe ecosystems in terms of structure. And then they also have function. So they have structure, they have function. Here's a function. To have energy, you could talk about different functions. Here's an example. You have energy flowing through the system. So it's the same kind of thing. You could plot this in the same way that you saw in the previous slide, but now we have this more linear system. And what you can see is that in every step, some of the energy is used, but some is lost as heat. The caterpillars that eat this grass and flowers, some becomes useful energy and tissue for that caterpillar, other heat is lost in biological function. Same thing as you go up, up, and up. At every step, energy is lost. What this means is that in order to have this structure, to have this logic to any ecosystem, you require massive inputs of energy. And most of it is lost. So you can think of really all life as pockets of order in a vast sea of disorder. So ecosystems have structure, they have function. And with this heat loss, being a vegetarian, eating low on the food chain, ecological efficiency is about 5 to 20%. with about 10% being the general rule. So two things with regards to food here. One, as you walk up each one of these trophic levels, trophic means feeding, you have 10,000 usable units of energy of phytoplankton, microscopic organisms. If that man filtered those all out of the ocean and ate them, or a lake or something, that would go much farther. It'd feed many more of his ilk. What happens is the primary consumers, the zooplankton, eat all of this phytoplankton, and you see as you go up, there's but 10% of the usable energy. The rest is lost in this vast sea of waste heat. The perch eat these primary consumers, and then the human eats the perch. So when we talk about food, agriculture, eating animals versus plants, irrespective of sustainability issues, ethical issues, it is most efficient to eat lower on the food chain. It is also more, health, you can say health-wise, because we have pollution everywhere, right? We know this. There's pollution everywhere. So if there's water pollution in here, you can take this and turn it upside down to describe bioaccumulation, pollution. So if we have 1 milliliter of pollution in this water, dioxin, the fact that these animals are all eating these plants means that then you have 10 milliliters, then you have 100, then you have 1,000 milliliters of dioxin in that man's blood. These are in equilibrium with the water, but as you go up a trophic level, you get 10 times the amount of pollution that's in these foods. That's why we can't eat a lot of fish, right? The big predators, because they're so high in mercury. Last two slides. One. Primary productivity. We've already established what that is. Either how much carbon dioxide comes out of the atmosphere at the hands of these ecosystems, or how much biomass is made, or both. What you see here is a picture where we talked about this already, right? The rainforests, swamps, marshes, estuaries, the highest biological productivity there is. We should be protecting these, right? Because they're taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This is in net primary productivity, kilocalories per square meter, that should say square meter per year. And then as you go down, you see things like desert, tundra, the open ocean are very low. So you could be tempted to say, we don't need to protect these as much. Those are the ones we should protect because they are so valuable to us for all that they do. However, if I show you this same graph, but now instead of looking at average per meter square, so you're saying, okay, 1 square meter of estuaries is responsible for 9,000 kilocalories per meter per year, square meter per year. Now I show you overall multiplying this by how much of each of these environments are around. What you see is not a complete turning upside down, but large turning upside down. You have to factor in that open oceans account for 72% of Earth. So while estuaries are tremendously productive, there's not a lot of them around. So we have to factor in both of these. The things that stay up at the top, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, and savanna. So those are our big friends in solving environmental problems. And the bottom line, again, you have this slide, ecosystems themselves are profoundly important because they are the things that moderate our climate, that make it habitable for us here on Earth. They are the things that recycle vital nutrients so we will continue to have food to eat. They are the things that provide us with the very mineral and energy resources that we'll be talking about during the course of this semester, upon which our survival is predicated. They pollinate our crops, again, so we can eat. We cannot eat without crops being pollinated. They are also, useful